We've got the vet, we've got a photographic shop, we've got another nail salon. So we got it's the smaller retailers in the mall that probably make up about, I don't know, Costa, everybody else, we probably make up about 40%, maybe not necessarily in retail space, but we make about 40%. There's hairdressers here as well. So this is a group of us that are in this mall. We've been there for a long time. It's been a very tough last few weeks, as you know, with the corona and the COVID changes that have happened. The foot traffic has been reduced dramatically. And some of us have paid the rental in full for April. Some have paid their rates and taxes and the utilities around that. But the landlord has not been very transparent. The landlord has not, most of us have sent the landlord some kind of documentation to say, hey, what's happening? We closed. What's the game plan? And the answers we've been getting is, you must just, it's business as usual. This is your lease. No indication whatsoever of any kind of reduction, etc. So that's where we are inside the mall. And I don't know if anybody else has anything to add, but please go ahead and add this, guys.
Brian, it's nice to see you there.
Aha, where's Brian? I don't see Brian. Oh, there's Brian in the middle. Yeah, so firstly, can everybody hear us?
All right, so Aki, I tell you what, I'm going to do.
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
Aki, I'm going to start and I'm just going to talk generally. And then I think what I want to do as well is, as you can see from the screen, I've got the questions you've sent me up on the screen as well. But before we talk about the questions, I want to just very quickly tell you about the current scenario or situation and how we're handling it. When I say we, I'm talking about the South African Independent Tenants Association, which has roughly about 700 tenants now around the country, which are its members. And really what we're trying to do is, on a shopping center by shopping center basis, trying to represent the collective of the tenants to the landlords in a very non-confrontational, non-oppositional way. But importantly, on the 7th of April, this document came out. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen it by now, but this is a document that was permitted by the Department of Trade and Industry via what they refer to as a block release. Now, ordinarily, landlords would not be able to talk to one another. In fact, tenants would not be able to talk to one another because of the assumption that there's collusion going on. You're colluding on prices, you're colluding on trade practices, etc., etc. In this instance, what's happened, the Minister of Trade and Industry has said, no, look, guys, I'm lifting that competition, that anti-competitive legislation, giving you enough time to get together and to talk about what you can do to help tenants on the one hand, and from a tenant's perspective, what you can do to help yourselves. So what happened is that the South African Council for Shopping Centres came together with South African Property Owners Association and South African Rates Association. Unfortunately, they called themselves PIG, the Property Industry Group. But quite frankly, I think if you look at their offer, you can understand why they've called themselves PIG, because ultimately they're not interested in SMEs. In fact, they literally say that they classify SMEs as companies doing a turnover of 80 million rand or less, 80 million rand or less. And from an essential goods perspective, essentially a discount because of the amount that they would have to be doing, more than 80 million rand. And you can see that specifically in their essential goods service component. Now, I introduce this to you to say to you that these landlords have all come together and they've basically colluded themselves on putting an entire incentive package into the marketplace that doesn't make sense in terms of the small and the independent tenants, you guys. And so SITA, the South African Independent Tenants Association, has said we're going to sort of take a block of tenants in the shopping center. We're going to go to the landlords. We're going to say to the landlords, sorry, but we're not happy with your proposals. We don't accept your proposals. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we are saying we have our own response to you as a landlord, and we'd like you to consider this response. So before I get to your questions, I just want to very quickly go through the response, because what we say in the response is, and it gets customized shopping center by shopping center, obviously, because in some shopping centers, for example, the preferred mechanism of doing business is a percentage of turnover rather than a fixed rental. Whereas in other shopping centers, particularly the professionals who don't want their landlords to actually see their turnover, they'll say, no, we'll stick with the rentals. But essentially, we go in and we say this: we need to distinguish between things like rates, taxes, municipal services, security levies, and insurance expenses, because those are the things that ordinarily we know need to be paid. And so we are going to tender those components of what needs to be paid because we want to play with rent. We want to make sure that we get the greatest kind of concession from them in the rental space. So we're going to tender these payments, and different shopping centers have different labels. And in fact, in some shopping centers, the security levy and the insurance levy is absorbed into the rent so that there are no charges for security and insurance. And what we're saying to them is, we'll tender those payments to you, and they'll be tendered to you subject to the fact that all of these things are things that, in fact, the municipality is prepared to give you both a payment holiday on, which means reduce your rates and taxes, or alternatively, give you deferment of payment until after the lockdown on. So whatever you get from the municipality, we're going to prepay it because we have to prepay it in terms of our lease agreement, but we're going to want to see that you're asking for some of these concessions from the municipality, and importantly, that you pass the benefits of these concessions on to us. So we're saying these payments will be tendered subject to the balance of the request to you being accepted and agreed, subject to a weekly report distributed to our members indicating the efforts you've made with the municipality in terms of payment holidays and deferred payments. Critically important. And I think the important thing is to say that we reserve the right to pursue against any landlord who might have got concessions from the municipality but has not passed those concessions on to its tenants. And that's happening again and again and again, unfortunately, we're finding out. Look, there are some very good landlords. There are landlords out there who don't wait for the tenants, but they come to the tenants and say, don't pay us rent, just pay us rates and taxes. And they're amazing. We want to know them, we want to laud them, etc. But the average landlord is taking chances, and that's the problem. And this is one of the areas they're taking chances in. What we're also saying to them is that in tendering these things, rates, taxes, etc., we want you to consider on a cash-by-cash basis our members' application to you, the guys who are locked down, who are closed, who can't be trading, for deferment of those charges should the tenant's current cash flow not allow them to make those payments. We want you to defer those charges for repayment after lockdown over a 6-month or a year's period. So that's the first thing that we say. Now, the second thing we say to them is this: look, this thing about a marketing levy is ridiculous in the time of lockdown. There's nothing for you to market about, and the whole world knows when the levy is going to be lifted. So we don't want to pay you the marketing levy, and we don't want to pay you a parking levy. And in fact, as far as we're concerned, those things should be incorporated into the rental payment. In simple terms, as the client of the property owner, our member has entered into a lease for the rental of a unit in a property that has acceptable footfall, is properly maintained, is attractive to destination clients and passing trade. Rentals received should more than compensate for creating that framework, which should become attractive to tenants to invest a large proportion of resources in to set up shop. Why should I have to pay extra for marketing your shopping center? It's what I'm buying from you in paying you rent in the first place. And as far as parking charges are concerned, well, then it goes without saying that our members refuse to pay parking fees for parking spaces that are not able to be used. Okay, so that's the offer, the first component of the offer. And basically, it's a component of the offer that's generally made because the real negotiation has to take place in terms of the actual rental payment. Now, there are many different opinions on rental payments. You will have seen that the Truworths Group has said we weren't paying rent, and then Sapoa got them into a room, and they ended up agreeing that they would pay 20% of rent. You've seen Discam have said we're not paying anything, knowing that they're going to get into a room eventually, and then they'll also have to pay about 20%, roughly about 20%. The PIGS guidelines have recommended 35%, but quite frankly, the big guys are able to negotiate their own rentals. So what we're saying to them is this: And this is just a suggestion. Every shopping center can change it. But as the businesses of our tenant members are closed due to lockdown, there is no benefit to be derived from occupancy. Based on the clauses, let me just quickly mute your microphones. Uh, 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 Based on the clauses and the terms contained in the original lease entered into, the benefit is simply not there to be derived. Therefore, our members, your tenants, are not in any position to earn income and pay a percentage of that income in lieu of rent. We are, however, encouraging our members to offer 10% of the current monthly rental charge in good faith, and as a sign of respect to the landlord, an acknowledgement that while our members are severely impacted, so is the landlord. Now, we say 10% because we know they're going to come back and ask for 80%, as is the case with the majority of landlords, and it's normally negotiated down to 20%. So it's a negotiating tactic. In some of the shopping centers, they've said, well, we don't want to offer anything and rather let the landlord come in. The problem is that if you don't offer anything, it becomes an unreasonable offer. And so they can then just decide to get litigious and say, well, these guys came in with an unreasonable offer. That's why we've not even considered anything else, quite frankly. We're simply going straight to the courts. Now, the important thing is this component here, recovery after lockdown. Because what we're saying as well is if lockdown is lifted at the end of April, we maintain that it'll take a minimum of 3 months for our members to fully recover. Some shopping centers have said 6 months, by the way, especially those who are restaurant intensive. And so for this reason, we're requesting a staggered payment schedule to be applied to the rental payments for those 3 months. And these are the suggested staggered payments. And we also say that for each month that lockdown is extended, the period of the staggered repayment will be pushed out by an equal amount of time. Now, that's quite important because if they agree to that, then they really will be acknowledging that they want you in the shopping center and they're prepared to fight to keep you in the shopping center. We sweeten it a little bit by saying we'll allow a landlord recovery, which is a lease extension, for the same period of time. So our members recognize and acknowledge your own financial exposure during the state of lockdown. And we therefore, in good faith, tender the following: that for every month of lockdown and the recovery period of 3 months we calculate thereafter, our members will agree to extend the existing lease for that identical period. Now, the reason we do that is we've found that what's been happening is that landlords have been coming back and saying, okay, we'll give you 50% rent reduction. But for that 1 month's 50% rent reduction, we expect you to sign a 1-year extension of the lease at an 11% escalation. And for a 2 months, if we give you May as well, then we expect you to sign in total a 3-year extension of the lease for that 2-month benefit we're going to give you. So in this landlord's recovery offer, we're trying to limit anything they can say about the extension of the lease on the one hand, and more importantly, the escalation of that lease value. So we're trying to delay the escalation of any lease value by at least that 4 or 5 month period, during which time the landlord recovery period is active. It's critically important in terms of negotiation technique. Now, what we also want from them is nolle prosecute, which means that they won't prosecute. They won't take summary judgment, no application for attachment, no locking, no shuttering of your businesses, no blacklisting, etc. We need that agreement for them to say that they waive their right to doing that, because otherwise, and we've already seen landlords starting to take attachment orders against some tenants. Then we've seen a very weird thing going on, but I know 5 landlords that are doing this. They've introduced a voucher system into their shopping center where they are communicating. They're using your marketing levy to communicate with your customers. And they're saying to your customers, we want you to pre-buy a voucher because it's going to help these businesses. Pre-buy a voucher in Sorbet, pre-buy a voucher at Mug and Bean, so that when we open again after lockdown, you can use that voucher, and the voucher will be brought to us, the shopping center. And so what they're expecting you to agree to, and please, even if you disagree with everything else I've said, you must not agree to this particular scheme, that they will pre-sell vouchers in your business. Because what they say is you'll pre-sell the vouchers so that we can set the income from the vouchers off against the rent you owe us. So for the rest of your life, you're going to be working to fund the cost of the lockdown that should have been a shared risk between yourself and the landlord. So these are the kinds of things that we have said in our letter to landlords, that we're wanting them to come back to us rather than us going back to them on their pigs proposal, which quite frankly is absolutely unacceptable to us. Absolutely unacceptable. Any questions or comments on what I've covered? I know I've covered a lot, guys. So before I carry on with your questions, any questions or comments you've got for me in terms of some of the things that I've said?
Ivor?
Yes, Brian.
Hello.
Hello.
Where you've been open and restricted in your sales, in other words, only essential. In case of us, we were allowed to sell dog food, so that was and flea and tick. The negotiation for the rental, does it stay the same?
So, Brian, what we want to do is we want to, in Norwood, for example, we want to say, right, who are the essential services? And basically, we want to have a different letter and a different tack on behalf of those essential services, because they're going to go back to their PIGS agreement. I love the acronym, but it's so unfortunate. But they're going to go back to the property industry group agreement that they've put together. And they're going to look at what the property industry group have elected, or rather have agreed to say about essential services. So, for example, they're saying here, as far as essential services are concerned, all retailers with annual turnover above 80 million rand, and then they say, right, we'll pay us 35% rental and 15% rental deferment, and in May, 15% rental deferment and 35% rental deferment, or rather discount and deferment. So they've got clauses in there for companies doing more than 80 million rand. And Brian, that's not you.
I wouldn't be sitting here.
No, you'd be sitting in Romania, as you say to everybody. So that's not you. Then they're saying, right, what about those retailers who are doing more than 75% essential services? So you're selling food, basically. So you're 100% essential services. Now, because you're 100% essential services in terms of selling dog food, you get no relief whatsoever as far as their proposal is concerned. Okay, which is ridiculous and it's stupid and it's rubbish and it's abusive. Did you hear me now?
Hello,
Brian, can you hear me? Brian, can you hear me? Can the other guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So basically, in your instance, Brian, where you're 100% essential services, you get, in terms of their proposal, you get no rent relief whatsoever. If you decide that it's not worth opening and it's too dangerous for that matter, or your staff don't want to come to work, so you make a decision that you don't want to be open as an essential services, again, you get no relief whatsoever. So these guys are setting themselves up and saying, we are insisting on these essential service businesses being open. And if they don't open, they still have to pay us rent, which, as far as we're concerned, is rubbish, stupid, it's nonsensical, and it's fraudulent. And we're quite specific about that. And then they start playing with 80 million rand again, and they start making compensation for like a Dis-Chem of this world, which really doesn't affect you. So that's the PIGS proposal. And quite frankly, as far as essential services is concerned, that PIGS acronym is very, very appropriate. That's what the PIGS are proposing, quite frankly. And Brian, yes, sorry, Aki, let me just finish this point. So what we are saying in this regard is we would put those essential service businesses who wanted to cooperate together, and we'd say to them, right now, we want to go to the landlord and say to the landlord, I might be running my essential services business, but I've got 50% of my turnover if I'm lucky. Therefore, 50% of my business should be discounted and my rent should be discounted, etc. And so we make an argument for you in that regard. We have to make an argument for you in that regard. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I cut you off. No, what I wanted to ask you, Ivor, I mean, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty here. I mean, the president has said this lockdown is going to be lifted on the 1st of May. Other people are talking about only peaking in August, September of this year. You know, my gut feel is that this is going to continue for a while still. And, you know, many industries, such as mine, for example, won't open. They might lift up some restrictions on the lockdown. But, you know, what happens if this is prolonged and it goes on for the next 3 months? or even, God forbid, up until September, where you're not going to have the same kind of volumes coming to the mall. You might not be operational as a nail salon or a hairdresser, for example, or a coffee shop that has to have various social distancing restrictions. So if this is a prolonged period, it changes all of the scenarios you've spoken about, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It certainly does change the scenarios. And from a business point of view, Aki, what we have to do is we have to put you in a position where your fixed overheads are neutralized as best as is possible. If you don't have money, then our job is to say to the landlords, even though we accept that some of the elements are owed to you, you're going to have to take an IOU, which is subject to the lifting of the lockdown. It's really that simple. You can't get blood from a stone. And you're not allowed to cancel leases. So that block release that the Minister of Trade and Industry, in it, he actually made the statement. He actually said in that block release that you entitled as a tenant to take all action to preserve your business, including restricting your rental payments, etc. So in that regard, you're entitled to think along those lines.
Yeah, Trevor, Ivar, does the tenant like ourselves, do we have any kind of protection over this period? I know that there are some restrictions that landlords can or can't do, but if you're in breach of your contract in this period, sorry, whoever's got their microphone on and has got stuff happening in the background, can you please mute yourselves? Thank you. So, during this period where, it's very uncertain, as I said, there are certain restrictions. Does the landlord have the right to impose, if you've signed a surety, for example, and you haven't paid for 3 months, to say, I am cancelling your lease and I'm coming after you for the money and I'm going to come after you for that surety that you signed for as well?
All right. So a couple of things. First of all, that's not in the spirit of the block release, number one. There is no forum for them to be able to cancel your lease in at this moment in time for the period of the lockdown. No court will entertain that application based on the PIGS agreement that's come out and the indication that all landlords should enter, don't have a choice, but should enter into engagement with the clients. However, in the PIGS release, they, as far as I'm concerned, very unfairly say that if you're not up to date with your payments for February of 2020, then in fact we reserve the right not to come to an agreement with you. And the Department of Trade and Industry have said, hold on a moment, that's not fair. We don't accept that, even though it's in that document, we don't accept that. So, Aki, I'm saying to you that there is a freeze on them taking that kind of action against you, because the center is supposed to be locked down, and you can literally show that you couldn't practice because of an intervention by government. So they'd be disingenuous by taking any of that kind of action. If you haven't paid your lease for 6 months, for example, and they've on a regular basis, demanded, and you still haven't paid, et cetera, then it's a 50-50. That first of all, they'd have to bring an urgent application to court, because court is not open to actually hear normal cases like this. It would have to be an urgent application, which they wouldn't succeed on. So I'm saying to you, you don't have to worry about the lockdown period. What your game plan is how you're going to play for the recovery period of 3 to 6 months thereafter, before you're fully exposed to your landlord again. That's what you really have to be negotiating and playing for here. It's taken for granted that they have to come to the party for the lockdown period, and they'd be ridiculously stupid not to, quite frankly. But many landlords are being that stupid, but then you simply contest them, and you simply don't pay. You simply don't pay, because there's, quite frankly, literally nothing they can do about you. Their lawyers can try, but it will be rejected. So my answer to you is, you don't have to be worried about the lockdown period. It's about the recovery period and how you negotiate for that recovery period. As far as your banks are concerned, you're entitled to go to your banks and ask them for a relief. And the banks, some of the banks are giving relief in terms of deductions in payments. Some of the banks are saying, well, we'll defer your payments, but we're still going to charge you interest. Others are saying, well, we'll defer your payments and we won't charge you interest or penalties. It really is very much on a bank-by-bank basis. I would say to you, you judge your bank during this period of the lockdown, because banks should not be supported after the lockdown is lifted if they have not supported you, number one. And number two, I would say to you very seriously, guys, remember 2008, because in 2008, we bailed these banks out. And they're showing very, very little memory for the fact that most of them should have been out of business because they were fraudulent. They caused a global fiasco. And in South Africa, they caused many of you to lose a lot of money. So the point I'm trying to make is your banks have very short memories. And quite frankly, I don't see these banks surviving after the lockdown that are not coming to the party. Remember, please, no bank is going to come to you and offer you anything. You have to go to your bank and you have to ask for the COVID relief and the COVID AIDS package. And they've got dedicated people who've been appointed to talk to you about relief and AIDS. Don't talk to your normal banker. Don't talk to your customer service agent or your private banker, because they won't know. Ask them who is there who has been charged with dealing with the relief package discussion, and only talk to those people. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. But it is difficult. And, you know, there is a claim that the small business department is making benefits available. Business partners are making benefits available. I can tell you that the conditions under which, you know, you're at the moment having to apply, you might as well try and make application for all of those benefits. And I have a webinar, separate webinar on all of those benefits that I can make available to you in this group. If you invite me to your WhatsApp group, I can start sharing information. And that webinar was one of them, with a slideshow. But the point I'm trying to make is you've got to know you're fighting an uphill battle, particularly if you are not a black woman or a black young person, or in fact a 51% black owned business, because that's simply the way the small business department have put their structure together. And for those of you in the hospitality and tourism industry, and I've just come off running a webinar on that I can also make available to you, but there is a 50,000 Rand grant if you're shut and you're a sit-down restaurant, or you're a travel agency or a tourism business. You can apply for that grant. But there again, you have to have a triple BE rating as an exempt micro enterprise, which a white-owned business can have at a level 4, and you might very well qualify for funding there. So there are funding mechanisms available. You just need to know about them and you need to apply for them.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated, Ivor.
So should we go to your questions now and see which ones we haven't answered? Yes, sorry. Yes, Trevor. How's it, Trev?
Right. Hi, Ivor. How are you, Ivor?
Fine, thanks.
Good, good. I've just added you to. Our group. Okay, so just I'm happy with everything that you've got there. I was just listening to another webinar that was on just before this, and I think Aki was on that one as well that I saw. They definitely recommended a 6-month clawback. You've put in your proposal here a 3-month clawback. Firstly, are most people doing a 3-month clawback? Certain industries and businesses may be able to recover in 3 months, because depending on the type of industry and services that they're providing. But others, obviously, and I think particularly in my particular industry, where it's a complete luxury item, it's certainly going to take longer than 3 months to try and claw back to where I was before.
So, Trev,
let me answer
that's
just point number one quickly.
Let me answer that question first. So, first of all, the PIGS proposal was very specifically about a payback period for what's deferred during the April month and maybe the May month. So that wasn't a clawback indicator. That's the first thing. But conventional wisdom says that, yes, it is going to take about 6 months to recover. And you can change this agreement to reflect a 6-month period with more of a staggered graduation of what you're prepared to pay for rent. You can definitely do that. We've had 2 different shopping centers, one being Cape Gate and the other one being the Cape Quarter. Funnily enough, both Cape Townian, where we've introduced that 6-month payback period, or rather clawback period, to get to 100% of the rent that you'll actually owe the landlords. So the answer is yes, 6 months can be used, but traditionally we've been using 3 months, which is the law of averages. Sorry, you had a second question.
Okay, I've just put my mic back on again. Can you hear me? I've just put my mic back on again. Sure. The second question is in terms of rent that I did pay already at the end of March for April. which is also linked to my negotiating of a new lease, which expires in 2 months' time. So I just wanted to put myself in good standing with the landlord and decided to pay that rental using the March turnover that I used. So now how do we approach it in terms of moving forward now that the rental has been paid? In some cases, I know on our group of guys have paid a percentage of their rental and some in full. How do we use that going forward?
Well,
surely they can't just say to us, well,
no, how we use that going forward is this. So the April concession will then apply for the May payment, and the May payment will then apply for the May concession will apply for the June payment if it's extended into May as well. If that makes sense.
Okay, and then just in terms of renegotiating now, that I know that I think Brian as well, he said that his lease is up in August. So we just want to know your thoughts in terms of maybe this might be on a personal thing because it doesn't involve more guys. It's just maybe myself personally a renegotiation and the way forward with that.
So one of the things.
I'll phone him back later.
Oh, let me just switch this.
I'll phone him back.
Brian, switch your phone off, man. All right.
Sorry.
Fine, I'm joking. All right. So the benefit of what we've offered to the landlords as a set package is saying to them that if the lockdown is for 2 months, for argument's sake, and the slow integration of getting back to business is for 3 months, those 5 months, we are prepared to make that an extension of the existing lease agreement, as long as there's an agreement that there'll be no escalation of that lease agreement. So, Trev, if they accept that, what that will effectively do then, it will stall your need to renegotiate your agreement and therefore pay an increment in your percentage for 5 months. So if it's in, or let's say for argument's sake, that 5 months ends in December, it will then mean that you only have to negotiate your lease extension from January of next year, and then whatever increment is in your current lease agreement only kicks in from January next year. So effectively what we're doing is we're forestalling the need to have a lease extension discussion until that 5-month period is finished, and importantly, any increment from 10% to 15% or whatever it is, any of those increments won't kick in until your new lease agreement actually kicks in as well. It's a serendipitous benefit. It wasn't intentional, but it's a serendipitous benefit. Does that make sense?
Okay, sorry, yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much. There was one thing that's just gone off the top of my head now. In terms of approaching the landlord now, do we do this as a group of 13 of us using this template, or do you approach them on our behalf with a list of the stores that you represent underneath it? In terms of the way forward here.
Ideally, what we do, the agreement, the proposal actually says we represent your tenants in Schedule A. So we ask you to actually sign a schedule online for us. So it's a Google form, and you simply say you want to participate. And then we include your name in Schedule A as their tenant. And we do it as a group on behalf of those tenants who've signed in Norwood Shopping Centre. And we approach your landlord rather than you approaching your landlord to have this engagement. Now, typically what happens is the first result from the landlord is we don't talk to collective organizations. We only talk to our individual tenants. In fact, it's in their lease agreements. Our argument is, well, then hold on a moment. This block release that the DTI have signed and gazetted means you must talk to us because the tenants have a right to collect. And in terms of the Labour Relations Act, in terms of the Constitution, and in terms of the International Labour Organization, the tenants have the right to something called affiliation. Bearing in mind, South Africa at the moment is president of the International Labour Organization. What is it you're saying to our government? That you don't respect their rules and their laws in terms of affiliation? It's exactly the same argument a trade union might make, for example, for recognition. So that's the argument we make, so that they agree, so that we get them into bed, if you want, for that purpose, before we start negotiating with them any further, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Either?
Yes, Brian.
It does. Would that also, this approach to the landlord, would that also include us who did were able to open for essential sales only?
So, Brian, we'll make a decision.
Or do we have to go separate?
No. So here's the point. We'll make a decision about that. And let me tell you why I say we'll make a decision about that. Our decision will be based on whether or not Harry's Pet Food is the only organization in the entire center that actually is regarded as an essential service. Because the likelihood is that it's highly unlikely that Dis-Chem will want to play with you as an essential service, because they're on their own tack nationally in terms of a national engagement with landlords. So it's highly unlikely that they'll want to play with you. I mean, let's be honest about that. So the bottom line,
No, sure.
So the bottom line is what we'll be doing here is we'll then be saying, right, if there are no other essential services we can play with, then in fact we will include you on that list, and we'll deal with you on that list as one of the tenants. And we'll make a separate argument in that document for you as one of those tenants.
That sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Good.
Yes, Mr. Laser, how are you?
How's it, Vic?
How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. I'm sorry that my sister-in-law actually messed up your relationship with all of your customers.
How did she do that?
She brought the virus back, didn't she? But that's a different argument.
Okay? That's your sister-in-law. Okay.
All right.
Indeed.
Okay.
So, do we have in that letter any sort of time period for them to respond to us in? Because it's already the middle of the month coming up now.
So no, we don't. We can obviously put a time period response in, and in the letter we say, please, we need you to come back to us so we have a timeous agreement in place by the end of the month, because that's the end of shutdown officially, unless it gets extended. So that's what we say to them. That's the sum total of the time we give them. However, and this is the legal part of it, we send them a list, if you want, of demands. We don't call it that, it's a request, but we send them a list of demands. Immediately we send them a list of demands means we've started the engagement process, the negotiation process. And because of that, you are then legally, forget about COVID, but you are legally entitled then to suspend any payments to them until such time as that negotiation has been completed. And so we will wait for them to come back to us. And then in our letter of response to them, when they come back to us, we will tell them, hey guys, and by the way, we're telling you that until we finish this negotiation, we are suspending all future payments of whatever sort, variety, or nature to you. And they'll hum and haw and they'll bitch and they'll moan, but there's really nothing they can do about that. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we want to be unfair to the landlord. The landlords have major headaches on them at the moment. However, they have a much bigger buffer, quite frankly, than you have as small independent tenants. And unless they're prepared to show goodwill to you, we've got no choice. We have to be behaving like this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Just one last thing in terms of obviously now coming up to end of April and paying forward to May, we've got common area costs that we haven't been a part of, and it was also dealt with on this previous webinar that I was listening to. That are we responsible? What's your take on, are we responsible for common area charges that have not been part of us during this lockdown period, or are we still liable for them? I know that they don't form a big part of the rental. Obviously, the common area charges are much smaller, and everyone's water and electricity store base is obviously going to be much lower because of the meter readings that just haven't taken place over lockdown. And the common area charges, but every rand counts at the end of the day at this point in time. So even if it's a couple of R100 here for air conditioning and for water and for refuse removal and operating costs and marketing fund, especially because we haven't been there to take advantage of it.
So, Trev, my answer to you is we can try something like that. What you have to remember, though, is that those common area costs are incorporated into the pre-existing rental costs that have been presented to you, which makes it difficult then. It makes it difficult because you have to try and distinguish and reverse out those costs. And quite frankly, it might become absolutely impossible to do that. So we have to manage through it. we have to manage through it on the basis of saying that we have to at all times be reasonable about how we're managing through it. But if it's an exercise you want to do, then we can certainly make that suggestion to them that besides what we're tendering to them in terms of rentals, we are insisting that they reverse out the common area components of rates and taxes, water, sewage, etc., etc. It might become an impossible exercise, but it might be a negotiating tactic depending on what you know about your landlords. Now, I know your landlords, so I know that how remote they sometimes.
It's unlucky for you.
No, I know how remote they sometimes can be. And I also know that they're most probably going to hide behind the PIGS offer that was put out generally to the industry. But we could certainly try that. Yes,
okay, well, it may not be worth upsetting the apple cart for those nominal costs on the common areas to keep in good faith with the landlord at this stage.
Sorry, Aki, you were saying?
Yeah, I have a question. We don't have a specific force majeure clause in our leases. I've heard somewhere that the force majeure clause can be implemented even if it's not in a lease. Where do we stand and how does that work? Do you have any idea about force majeure? Is it recommended?
So you cannot apply a force majeure clause to a lease because you can be certain that they've excluded the force majeure clause. But the reality is you don't need to depend on either an act of God or a force majeure clause to be negotiating what it is you're trying to negotiate. Where the force majeure component becomes quite important to consider is the impact on insurance, because your insurance companies have let you down dramatically if they're basically saying, look, you're not covered for these kinds of events, because in fact, they knew almost 9 years ago in the mining sector, in the chemical sector, where they had to rewrite policies because of force majeure activities that had taken place over that period of time. They knew that they had to accommodate for force majeure. But if they've not sold you anything that incorporates the opportunity to claim force majeure, then they've been negligent at the very least. Although there are many people now starting to say they've been fraudulent, quite frankly, and they've taken your money knowing that they should have made allowance for something like a pandemic, but they never made allowance for a pandemic. What I do want to attach to your group, though, is a very, very good comment that was made by this Maya on Money lady that, in fact, Aki, you've been carrying her on 702.
Yeah, mine is French.
Yeah, and she's fantastic, but she talks specifically about credit insurance and how none of you are actually realizing that wherever you have a credit facility from your bank has had to automatically buy a credit facility for that facility that you a credit policy for that facility. So whether it's an overdraft that you're using, or whether it's a lease that you're using, a bond that you're using, etc., every one of those has credit insurance, and you are very definitely covered for something like a pandemic in your credit insurance policies. And there again, you need to be talking to your bank, but the right people at your bank. If you talk to your average person that you deal with, they're not going to be able to answer the question because they've not been trained to answer the question.
Are you saying, Ivor, if I have a loan with my bank, for example, a business loan, that insurance is bonded together with that specific loan?
Of course.
Okay, that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Of course. It's been part of regulations in this country for a long time now, because remember, banks were lending indiscriminately, unsecured, etc., 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 and then they were trying to repossess houses and cars, etc. And the authorities came to them and said, hold on a moment, you should be insuring against the eventuality that the person can't pay you back, even if it's for a short period of time or if it's as a result of a pandemic or whatever it is. So, Aki, what I'm saying to you is I will send you the video that Maya did, so that you can actually listen to it and her recommendations.
That's awesome. Ivor, I'm really aware of the time constraints. I know it's 5:30 already, and you did say you can be with us until 5:30.
Right. A number of us will be affected, whether it's Trevor or Brian or myself, we're affected by it. So unfortunately, we'll have to cut it off here. But what I can say to you, Aki, is I would like to have a follow-up discussion with you once you've thought about it. I will, on your group, if you invite me to it, and Trevor says he has invited me to it. So I'll attach our... Sorry?
Yes,
You are on the group already.
Oh, thank you. All right. So I will attach as many of these documents as I can, as many of the podcasts as I can that I've done, as well as Maya's thing. I will attach the letter of response so that you can go through it and maybe make recommendations. And then maybe if we have a follow-up discussion either on Friday or on Monday, just so that we can, by the middle of next week, agree to put something to your landlords, I would say that's what we want to do, Aki.
I agree, Ivor, and I just want to, on behalf of everybody, just say thank you so much. You've been absolutely amazing. I've learned so much. You've given us so many interesting insights, and we really thank you very much for your time. Really much appreciated.
It's a pleasure, guys.
Thanks, Ivor.
Nice talking
Thank
to all
you.
of you again. Hey?
Very much.
A good Jontif to everyone. Huh?
Thanks,
You too.
Ivor.
All right, thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ive. Nice to
Thank
chat
you,
to you.
Aki.
And
Thank you, Aki.
Aki, thank you very much for taking the initiative here on every
Sure.
across the year as well.
We're in
And
it together.
guys, stay strong. And Ivor, we're